Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the quiet hymns of a rural church, a secret was sealed that would echo through generations. The congregation thought they were witnessing a marriage blessed by God, but the truth was far more grotesque. The groom, a man of stern jaw and cold eyes, held the trembling hand of his bride. But this was no ordinary union. This was a wedding where bloodlines twisted into knots, where family ties were blurred beyond recognition. His wife was his own niece, a girl raised in the shadows of his authority, now bound to him in a way that defied both nature and morality. To the townspeople, it was strange, whispered about behind closed doors, but tolerated. Yet to those who dared to look deeper, it was the most inbred marriage ever recorded, a legacy of shame carved into the heart of one American family. The photographs, if you've ever seen them, are chilling. The couple stands stiff, unsmiling, their features unsettling in their familiarity, like a mirror reflecting back on itself. The groom's face, harsh and domineering, seems etched with the kind of pride that only comes from defying judgment. The bride, his niece, bears a vacant stare, her expression somewhere between fear and resignation. Some said she had no choice, that she was raised to believe this was her destiny. Others claimed she went willingly, seduced not by love, but by the heavy weight of family power. Either way, the result was the same, a bloodline collapsing inward, generation after generation. This was not a fairy tale marriage, it was a pact of secrecy and servitude, vow, hidden beneath layers of silence. Families like this one were not rare in the darker corners of early America. Poverty, isolation, and twisted interpretations of faith drove men to claim their own blood as wives. But in this case, the story lingered like a bruise, passed down in whispers, stamped into the very faces of their descendants. What began as one man's choice became a prison for all who followed, a haunting reminder of how a single marriage could poison a lineage forever. They thought no one outside their family would ever know. They thought history would forget. But history never forgets, and tonight you'll see why. He was not just her uncle, he was her guardian, her teacher, and the one man who decided her fate long before she could shape her own. She had grown up inside his household, her life carefully molded by his will. In those days, family ties were iron chains. When the whispers began, that she would never leave his side, that she belonged to him, it was spoken not as scandal but as inevitability. What could a young girl say when every path of her life led back to the same man, the same roof, the same authority? By the time she stood in front of the altar, it was no longer a choice. It was a sentence. The townspeople gossiped quietly, of course. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others muttered excuses about keeping wealth or land within the family. But when the vows were spoken, no one dared interrupt. In their silence, they became complicit. And so, what should have been unthinkable became tolerated, then accepted, then finally forgotten. Forgotten by all but the family itself, who carried the shame in their blood like a disease. Marriage in that era was supposed to represent hope, the continuation of legacy, the promise of new life. But this union carried a different weight. The children born from it bore more than just their father's name. They bore his very face. Jawlines repeating, eyes set too close, features doubled over as if the blood could no longer create anything new. In photographs that survived, you can see the collapse of variety, the tightening of a family tree curling back onto itself. Each child was a mirror of the last, and behind every mirrored face was the same question: what had been done to them? This was not an act of love, it was control, a man claiming ownership not just of a girl, but of his entire bloodline. And what is most chilling is how ordinary it looked from the outside. A marriage license, a church ceremony, rings exchanged under candid light. Nothing outwardly monstrous, yet every detail reeked of horror once you knew the truth. Because horror does not always wear fangs or claws. Sometimes it wears a suit and a smile and says, "I do," in front of God and man alike. As the years passed, the cracks in their union could no longer be hidden. Neighbors who once looked away began to notice the strange details that clung to the children like shadows. Their speech came slower, their movements less steady. Their faces carried that eerie symmetry that happens when bloodlines fold in on themselves. Some children did not survive infancy, their small bodies unable to withstand the weight of generations compressed into them. Those who did survive carried with them the proof of what had been done. Proof written in bone structure, in posture, in the haunting stillness of their eyes. The family lived apart, almost like a fortress unto itself. Outsiders rarely visited. When they did, they spoke of the quiet, the suffocating air of secrecy that hung in every room. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in peaceful homes, it was the kind that feels like a warning. A silence heavy with things never spoken aloud. The children rarely laughed. The mother, his niece turned wife, aged before her time, her face lined not by years but by resignation. To some, she seemed less a wife than a prisoner, bound to a man she could never truly escape. To others, she was complicit, keeping the cycle alive by bringing more children into the world, knowing what fate awaited them. And yet, the man himself carried no shame. If anything, he seemed proud. In photographs, he stands tall, gripping the shoulders of his sons as though parading his legacy. He spoke of purity of blood, of keeping the family strong, blind to the reality that strength was exactly what his choices were eroding. For him, this was not corruption. It was preservation. He believed he was building something eternal. In truth, he was dismantling it piece by piece. When people in town passed the family on the dirt roads, they would look quickly away, as if afraid that staring too long might invite the sea bursts into their own homes. Children whispered cruel names. Mothers pulled their sons and daughters aside, warning them never to get too close. Yet still, no one intervened. Silence became the soil in which this twisted marriage rooted itself deeper, and as each year passed, the damage grew harder to deny. Time is merciless when secrets are left to rot. By the second generation, the consequences of his choices had grown too visible to be ignored. Children born of that union carried not just the burden of their father and mother, but the compounded weight of bloodlines twisted into themselves. Some could not walk properly, their limbs bending in ways nature never intended. Others spoke with fractured words, voices that trembled like broken instruments. In their very existence was a living testimony of the marriage that should never have been. But the horror was not only physical, it was psychological, embedded into the very way this family lived. To the children, there was no distinction between father, uncle, husband, wife. Titles blurred, roles collapsed. Who was mother when she was also niece? Who was father when he was also uncle? This collapsing of identity crushed them from within, leaving scars that no photograph can ever show. Every time they looked in the mirror, they saw not themselves but the endless reflection of one man's will, a bloodline forced into submission. It is here that the story takes on its most unsettling quality, the normalization of the grotesque. Within the house, nothing was strange. Children called him father, she called him husband, and the rituals of daily life carried on like any other family. Breakfast at the table, work in the fields, prayers before sleep. On the surface, routine. Beneath it, horror. Because when horror becomes daily bread, it stops looking like horror at all. It becomes culture. It becomes tradition. It becomes something no one dares to question. Generations later, the legacy of that marriage still lingers like a poison in the bloodstream. Old photographs are pulled out of dusty trunks, and people whisper about the uncanny resemblance, the same crooked gaze, the same unnerving symmetry, the same hollow silence in their own faces. It is as if the family tree itself tried to scream but found no voice. Their descendants, scattered now, carry fragments of the story but not all of it. Shame made sure of that. The full truth was buried, locked away, but never destroyed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have broken free, or would you have carried the silence forward like they did? History does not just remember events, it remembers the atmosphere they leave behind. And this marriage between an uncle and his niece left behind a silence so thick it smothered generations. When outsiders later tried to trace the family tree, they found branches looping back upon themselves like a serpent devouring its own tail. Birth records blurred into confusion, fathers and uncles listed as the same man, mothers who were also nieces, cousins who were indistinguishable from siblings. It was less a tree than a closed circle, a cage of repetition. In towns like these, whispers never truly die. Old men in rocking chairs would shake their heads and mutter, "You know about that family." Women would lower their voices, their words dripping with equal parts disgust and pity. But though everyone whispered, no one acted. No church excommunicated them, no law punished them, no neighbor dared confront them. The family was left to fold inward, unchecked, unseen, until the damage was irreversible. And perhaps this is the most terrifying truth of all. The greatest horrors do not erupt suddenly, they fester quietly, in the corners where no one dares to look. This was not a crime of passion or a violent act in the night. It was a long, slow collapse, a collapse sanctified by vows, reinforced by silence, and hidden in plain sight. The wife, once the trembling girl forced into that marriage, became a hollow echo of herself. Her eyes dulled, her voice softened to almost nothing. She bore children, buried some, and watched others grow only to repeat the same strange fate. Her face in photographs reveals the truth words cannot capture. Resignation. A woman who no longer saw the line between victim and participant because both roles had consumed her. She was a ghost while still alive, haunting her own home. And he, the husband, the uncle, the architect of it all, walked through Lee's fee with the arrogance of a man convinced of his own righteousness. To him, the whispers of neighbors were nothing more than jealous chatter. He had preserved his bloodline, he thought. He had strengthened his family. What he never saw, what he refused to see, was that he had built not a legacy, but a tomb. As decades passed, the echoes of their marriage seeped outward, staining not just their descendants but the community around them. Outsiders who married into the bloodline often discovered too late the tangled roots they had joined. Some fled in shame, leaving behind spouses and children, unwilling to carry the weight of the family's reputation. Others stayed, trapped by obligation or fear, and in doing so their names became tethered to the same curse. The family name itself became a whisper of warning, spoken with a shiver. To bear it was to carry suspicion, pity, and ridicule all at once. And yet, with each generation, the story slipped further from memory, reduced to fragments. A child asking why all the faces in the photographs looked the same. A neighbor wondering aloud why the family never seemed to invite outsiders in. An old diary, scrawled with words that trembled between confession and denial. The evidence was never destroyed, only scattered, pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to assemble. Still, those who looked closely could see it, the chain of consequence stretching unbroken. Health failures, stunted lives, generations haunted by illnesses no doctor could fully explain. Behind it all was the shadow of that first marriage, an uncle who took his niece as wife, reshaping the destiny of everyone who followed. He may have gone to his grave unpunished, but his punishment was carved into the bodies and souls of his own children, and theirs, and theirs. Perhaps the most chilling realization is how easily this could happen again. Isolation still exists, secrecy still festers, families still hide sins behind closed doors, convincing themselves it is better to remain silent. What happened in this case was not unique, it was simply one of the rare times the truth bled through, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. The photographs remain, grainy, faded, black and white, images of a man standing beside his wife, his niece, A family posed stiffly for the camera, unaware that the image would one day tell the story they never wanted spoken aloud. Their faces are not monstrous, not at first glance, but look long enough and you will see it. The repetition, the collapse, the quiet horror of a bloodline folding in on itself. And so we return to the beginning. The wedding no one should have witnessed, yet everyone allowed to happen. His niece, dressed as a bride, stood trembling at the altar, and he, her uncle, stood certain of his power. That single moment, sealed with vows, unleashed a ripple that would twist through generations. What should have been a bond of protection became one of possession. What should have been family became a prison. It is tempting to believe this story is about one man, one woman, one family. But in truth, it reveals something far more unsettling. The human capacity to accept the unacceptable when it is wrapped in tradition, silence, and ritual. A marriage certificate, a church blessing, a family name. Together, these ordinary symbols became weapons of concealment, shielding an act that should have been seen as monstrous. And once hidden, it thrived in the shadows, feeding on silence until it became more terrifying than any scream. Even now, their descendants walk among us, most unaware of the exact truth, some carrying only fragments of memory, rumors of something strange in the family line. Others may suspect, staring into old photographs where faces repeat like echoes. They may wonder why their features are so eerily familiar, why their blood carries sickness, why silence has always felt heavier than words. Whether they know it or not, they are the living proof of what was done. This was not the most famous marriage in history. It was not written in textbooks or immortalized in monuments. But in its obscurity lies its power, because it reminds us of how easily horrors can hide in plain sight, how an entire community can watch and say nothing, how one decision can ripple outward for centuries. This is not just history, it is a warning. And perhaps, as you sit here listening, you realize the true weight of the story. It is not simply about them, it is about us, about what we allow, what we excuse, what we bury, because history is not only the past, it is the shadow we live inside every single day. So when you hear the title, His Wife Was His Niece, the most inbred marriage in history, remember, it is not only a story of then, it is a mirror held up to now,